Hi and welcome back. The next session we're going to be looking at some early return to workplace lessons, and I'm very pleased to welcome Wayne Liko to the stage. And as I mentioned, Wayne is a managing partner at systems integration firm Horizant. So a warm welcome to the virtual stage, Wayne, and over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad to join the conference and hope to have some great conversations with everybody today. So we'll jump right in. I know that we have obviously back-to-back. So today for the agenda, we're going to be covering 3 case studies. I'm going to summarize in the case study specific findings, but then we'll come back and kind of wrap with some broader best practices, and definitely leave some time for some Q&A. To set the stage, though, I thought to start the day off, we might initiate a poll. And I think this will help us get an understanding of where the audience might be at right now in terms of their return to work status. So I think Christy's going to fire off a poll here based on what you see on screen. So pick one answer that best fits your particular situation, and we'll come right back with sharing those results. And we feel like we need to have some Jeopardy music playing or something, but Susan said she wouldn't sing, so we can't have her do that.
Hit the countdown clock, Wayne.
The countdown clock, that's what we need on that. So I'll let Christy know when everybody's had a chance to reply, and we'll chat about the results here momentarily. Hopefully these categories fit for most people and they can find where they are. I think it'll help us, Susan, to kind of start with the sorry, just seeing a quick chat here. All right.
And actually, just to, I guess, talk to where Verdantix is in this, we're probably in no defined plans to return yet. I've actually gone into the office today, but we're a bit in a wait and see mode because the government advice keeps changing here in London. So yeah, we're kind of just holding out a bit until we decide to bring everyone back full time.
Yeah, it's a pretty common situation for most, in the sense that some of our clients had initial return to work target dates.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Depending on the particular health authorities and mandates or recommendations that they're making, they're obviously adjusting those and remaining agile. So we'll see. So Susan, I'm probably going to maybe we'll come back to the survey here.
Yeah, I think the results are still filtering in, so let's push on, and we'll get those shortly from the audience.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll just kind of power through and try and stay on track. Oh, I'm seeing some stuff pop up here that I can share. So Christy's just sending me some of the details. So in terms of results, 44% back in the office, 44% do not have any defined plans to return, 6% expect to return within 3 months, 3% within 6 months, and 3% not returning. So interesting, there's really a balance between no defined plans and the back in the office, both coming in at 44%. So thank you for that, Christy, and thanks everyone for doing that. So that helps us understand kind of where everybody's at. So let's go and look at some of the case studies now and give you 3 examples. The first one is a not-for-profit. They have about 27 locations. In their particular case, they had a room reservation system, but they really needed it to be focused around desks. So they went to market and looked for a desk reservation system. They also had the element of fleet management that they wanted. They had a shared fleet of vehicles that they wanted to book. Booking the desk, so self-declaring that you're coming into the office to help manage the occupancy levels, and then integrating that with their badge information, so being able to recognize who actually came in, and that helped inform things such as incident tracking or contact tracing should something happen. So that was really the project, very tight turnaround that they wanted to initiate. They were pushing it into the cloud to make the support and the maintenance that much easier. So to date, for most of these clients, it's still fairly early stages. They're seeing about a voluntary return of 10% of their staff. The other interesting piece that they're looking at from a data perspective, from what the technology is telling them, is that their leases, instead of going into full renewals of their leases, they're actually extending the leases. The data so far is indicating that they may be reducing some of their locations or consolidating certain offices. So instead of doing full renewals on their leases, they're just extending them and going forward. Of course, the data is gold. We're going to see this repeated throughout. We'll see different perspectives on the data, but for this particular client, one of the key things that they're really recognizing is the agility of the data. So the fact that they're able to see live what's happening, how people are using the space, how long they're staying in the space, is definitely informing them to things like the lease renewals, understanding what they might need to change within their space. So again, early findings. Second case study. In this particular case, a public sector organization, they had an existing IWMS solution. They were primarily assigned seating. So part of their project going forward for the return to work was converting that into unassigned seating. The focus was around getting the essential workers. So there's a lot of effort spent on reconfiguring the space where employees would have been sitting together or perhaps in disparate locations. They were able to use the existing data and kind of bring it back in. So that was their focus to get going. And really try and leverage as much of that within the existing platform. Interestingly enough, a side benefit for this particular client was the fact that they had an integration with their HR. But what they found in the return to work exercise, once they defined the use case and started working with bringing people back into the office, they actually found some gaps in the sharing of the data. So I guess a side benefit of the return to work is they've been able to tighten up the process of how they exchange and the value of the data between HR and their accommodation information. The result was, of course, an improved move process. Another key part to this is the fact that the accommodation, even though for most of our audience, you'd probably recognize the value that facilities and accommodation bring to the table within organizations, there's still this idea of the misunderstanding of the value of that. So they've resulted in getting onto the task force and identifying the importance of the data that they manage on a day-to-day basis and how that can influence the ongoing planning and portfolio decisions going forward. Third case study, and I'm moving through these fairly quickly because we'll summarize some of the points. Again, a larger client had an existing IWMS solution, primarily, again, unassigned seating, but they definitely had pockets of, primarily assigned seating, but they had pockets of unassigned projects that they had started. This was a legacy client, kind of 10 years of data, so they had a lot of information. We joked around a lot about the fact that they were data hoarders. They had a lot of information that they were collecting and not necessarily using in a productive way. So the project was both room reservations as well as desk reservations, a definite move to unassigned and pushing forward as quickly as possible on that. A key thing to the project was repurposing some of the initiatives. A great example of that is they had deployed sensors for utilization. In the context of that pre-pandemic, that was of course optimizing, trying to get as high utilization as they could within their space. In the pandemic world, we're now looking at how we cap that utilization. So it's the same data, the same technology, but what they're able to do is pivot around how they look at that. Instead of saying, I want to achieve 85%, we really want to get down to 20 or 25%. So it was an interesting take on how they leverage that. So as a larger organization with a lot of data, one of the things that happened was a lot of stakeholders came to the table with requirements. And it actually delayed and almost made it impossible to move forward with an initial return to work strategy. So what we were able to do is pare down on those requirements and get it into more of a phased approach. Again, it sounds very logical, but what was happening is a lot of people were trying to anticipate where they would be a year from now or even a month from now. If we were to look back at 4 months ago, I don't know that we would expect to be where we are today. So it really became an impossibility to fully plan around the requirements that somebody might look at for 18 months. So a key part there was the idea of phasing and simplifying those requirements. This particular client was very, very good at planning and communication. They went to great efforts to ensure that they had a return to work plan, that they were communicating and engaging with the stakeholders, whether that be leadership or whether that be the employees directly. What they don't know yet is how that's influencing or going to influence the return to work. When we look at the numbers so far in terms of the percentage of people that have come back to the office, it's still early game, so they're not sure of whether that's going to increase the idea of people coming into the office because they were better communicated with. But they actually, they certainly hope that that's the case. But tied to that is this idea of measure and adjust. Of course, in the technology world, we always talk about making informed decisions based on the data. What this particular client has found is that the data is part of the equation. That's kind of the empirical side of things. But the theory of people coming back into the office is equally important and seeking that feedback. They've actually gone one step further, which is to seek the feedback of the people who aren't coming back into the office and find out why that is. Is that a short-term trend, or is it an ongoing practice that they're going to have to account for in that? So they're really balancing that theoretical data and the empirical data to make the decisions. A great example of that many, I'm sure, are faced with is the return to school, and some employees saying, hey, I want to stay closer to the home base in case there's anything that happens with the kids at school, or perhaps even having kids at home. So it's interesting how they've not only used the data from the technology, but they've done that. So poll number 2, given that we just covered off some quick case studies, and we'll come back in a second, Christy's going to send off another poll for you guys and trying to understand where you might be in your technology decisions related to return to work. So pick one of these. Hopefully one of these categories fits the bill, and you can kind of work through that. I'm going to pay attention to the chat here, and we'll see how that goes in. So what'll be interesting is we saw earlier the 44% back to the office and 44% that had no defined plans. It'll be interesting to compare those numbers to these technology plans and see if we, for the 44% back in the office, are we going to see that 44% have technology plans, or are people flying by the seat of their pants? What do you think, Susan? What do you think we're going to see here on the results?
Yeah, it's interesting. I expect many people will still be evaluating if we have a large chunk of people that haven't got a defined plan. So that is where my bet is. We shall see, though.
Yeah. Well, they're starting to come in now. So let's see. In terms of the highest percentage is 32% are implementing a solution. 24% have no technology plan. 17% are evaluating right now. So that's interesting, interesting feedback on that. So thank you. Oh, 10% have selected a solution, but have yet to implement. So that kind of gives us a good run of that. So much to what we were talking about, Susan, even though 44% may be back in the office, not necessarily, they may have had to get back to the office before they had a chance to implement some supporting technology. So thank you, Christy, for that. That's good feedback, and thanks everyone for your feedback. Okay, so let's talk about a summary of lessons learned, and we'll start observationally with things, kind of the gut feel of what we're seeing. And I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by any of these. The idea of simplification, the idea of not knowing exactly where we're going to be a month from now, let alone a year from now. The idea of adoption will be slow. We'll talk a little bit more about that, because communication and planning is definitely an important aspect, and certainly the technology can help with that. You'll see that theme about data over and over again. The data is very important in the decisions of keeping people safe and how they return to work. So can we translate these observationally into, let's call them best practices? And I put a question mark beside that, because I'll leave that to the audience to decide how many of these are actually best practices. For the return to work, it's still, for the most part, fairly early. We've seen examples in the case studies that I presented about using existing data and technology. I think that it's qualified there by where possible. I think that a lot of people underestimate where they might have data and how they can reuse that data. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. The idea of starting small and building big, phasing into things is a key part. I've certainly seen the analysis paralysis happen across a number of clients where they try and encompass and anticipate everything. Fundamentally, I don't think employees are rushing back to the office. I think in our own surveys internally of our company, people are saying, look, I'll head back a day or two a week. But they always qualify it with the idea of assuming that the office is safe, and that the elevators are safe, and that there's certain protocols. So I think that's a fairly common thread across clients. Measure, analyze. The agility is going to be important. What we've seen in the case studies so far is that the data is providing part of the information. The interaction with the clients is important, and the employees, and understanding what they're experiencing and why they're coming in or not coming in, and making sure that you adjust accordingly. So probably you can look at this and go, hey, I probably knew that going in. Fair statement, but it's always nice to get some validation from some of these early adopters and people that are actually back into the office and using technology to support that exercise. So what I did when we were interviewing the clients, and I kind of left it open-ended, so you'll see the quotes. I asked each client to give me a quote, not necessarily summarizing where they are, but almost summarizing how they felt, which maybe would have been a scary proposition, because maybe it bordered on the one would say negative, or the frustration that they might have had in getting to where they are today. So it's interesting to look at this. One of the clients, as they were looking at the market and trying to figure out a tool to select, how it's become very, very busy. And you know, the saying goes, right, never waste a good crisis. So technology is no different than that, where they will get on and try and provide solutions. Obviously, in the same vein, on the technology side, the idea of user experience is important, and engagement. For this one client, their frustration was that the balance between the data that they could get and the employee experience, seemed to be overlooked, and the importance of that data being as important as the idea of the employee engagement. The last one is interesting, again, in the idea of where we are today and where we're going to be in the future, and how the information that we collect today will influence the future. So for a number of our clients, they are dealing with the pandemic and the return to work, but they are keeping an eye on where they're headed from their portfolio perspective. So that's an interesting statement of how technology can influence that. And it actually served the basis for my third and final poll, which might be a bit of a loaded question, but I think it's interesting to perhaps understand. We talked about where you are in the return to work. We've talked about where you are on the technology selection. How far are you on the conversation around your portfolio and how to optimize that, or the potential changes? It's not to say that we know exactly what's going to happen, but what it is saying is, are we keeping a watchful eye on what the return to work is telling us and how that might influence our portfolio? And Susan, I'm sure that this has been a discussion that you guys are having across a number of clients and vendors as well.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I have to say, we're seeing this as a major hot topic. Even in the pre-COVID era, people were becoming increasingly clued up to the potential of space efficiency. So yeah, and we're seeing many of those conversations really accelerate in the COVID era with much more home working. Yeah.
So I'm sure Christy is furiously working away on the answers. So let's pop that open and see.
That's right.
Okay, so feedback. Discussing but no changes planned yet is 33%. Discussion and planning underway, 32%, so equal. And then a flat out no is 24%. And we have some of our own early adopters and leaders here where they've actioned property or lease changes, and that's 4% of the audience. So some people are probably finding opportunities that they can identify right away in their portfolio where they can make the changes and kind of get ahead of that. So great, thank you, Christy, and thanks everyone for that. So that's the presentation. I thought I'd leave you with an image of the old days when we could walk down the street and get people bumping into us. So with that, I'll turn it back to Susan and see if there's any quick questions that I can address.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, Wayne. And as you say, it's always good to dig into some real life examples and learn from some of the early adopters. We have had some questions come in, so I'm going to select a few of them, and please do keep your questions coming in today. As I mentioned at the start, today's session is live, so please do make use of our great speakers that we've brought together. Question one, your case studies reference either existing data or technology. What if we have neither? Any recommendations?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, but I would challenge on the putting aside the technology for a second. I would challenge the comment on the data. I think that most clients that we work with will find data somewhere, HR, IT, and there's something that is usable. I would further qualify that by saying, make sure not to over-engineer the data that you're trying to capture or use. So I think that if you look deep enough, you'll find some data.
Okay, very good. And that's exactly right. So I mean, potentially a good place for people to start to sort of a bit of a data audit and go around to function heads and find out what systems are already in place. So that's some good practical advice there.
Sure. Yeah.
Time, I think, for one more question. What have you seen as the key data criteria for initial return to work?
Oh, well, that's an hour topic on its own, but to give it 30 seconds, I think that we've seen long lists. We've seen lists of 100 requirements come out of conversations. For the most part, what we find is in the initial return to work, who's coming back, managing that occupancy, validating that they're actually in the office, and some level of incident tracking or contact tracing capabilities is fairly recurring, kind of those 4 or 5 topics of, and if you start with that, I think you'll find that tracking that information will influence the other data points that you're going to need to add to the equation. So I think hopefully that's a good teaser, but happy if you have other questions, by all means, send me that if you want more details.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that, Wayne. And we're just coming towards the end of the time for this session. So that was a really awesome presentation. And actually, one of the best practice tips that really resonated with me was keep it simple. We've seen some of the initial return to work retail reopening programs have had lots of moving parts and so much complexity that as a end user, it just becomes a bit complicated around what do you do. So I think that kind of tagline there around keeping it simple is a really useful one.
Definitely.
So pushing on, we're going to be having Wayne stick around for a little bit longer, and we're going to be calling up Nathalie Leclerc to our virtual stage, who's going to be talking in more practical terms around a really exciting workplace program that she's been working on at the Government of Canada. So just bear with us as we welcome Nathalie to the stage.